This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you've had a great week. I know we had obviously a Monday. If you're listening every week, we know Monday was Memorial Day here in the U.S., where we're commemorating and remembering those who have died and fighting for our country. Hope you were able to take a few moments and acknowledge the sacrifice that those individuals have made, as well as their family and loved ones. So certainly a somber occasion, but it's also a time for many people to inaugurate the summer, of course, and so maybe you were able to take a few days off and spend some time with your family. Hope that's the case for you. So do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the podcast. Make sure you ring the bell so you get notified of updates. And of course, if you're interested in corresponding with me, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you, comments, thoughts about the shows, perhaps interview possibilities, new products, topics that you would like me to cover. Otherwise, I'm just going to talk about, as I say regularly, talk about what interests me, and we'll see where that goes. Well, this week I wanted to talk a little bit about chloroform. And so chloroform is quite controversial. It is something definitively problematic for some people, and I thought I would talk about it. I am certainly not an expert in the area of chloroform. I've had very little contact with it. I had the privilege to work a little bit with one wildlife control operator, spend some time with him, and he certainly used it, but he primarily used it just for skunks. And so, but in one association that I belong to, the issue of chloroform, wow, it really got heated pretty fast. Claims of unprofessional and no one should be using this. And so just thought I would dip my toe into this particular area, and certainly passions can run hot. I am not in a passionate mood about chloroform, but certainly I'm in the camp that thinks that this is an important tool for wildlife control operators, and I tend to have a bigger tent. So, but enough of that for now. Let's get into the presentation so that you can see what I'm talking about here. So again, congrats, you caught an animal. Now what are you going to do with it? Now let's talk about that. You certainly want to be humane, and so I want to give some definitions. I know definitions aren't popular in wildlife control operators, unfortunately, but professionals use professional language, and I'm maybe in the minority in this regard, but I'm going to keep banging this drum because I can't begin to tell this industry how important definitions are, and you should be considering how important it is to have proper definitions, because the person who controls the language controls the debate, and this is critically important. So when I use the word humane, we're referring to overall, how is an animal treated, whether you're killing this particular animal or not. Euthanasia has a much more narrow definition, and it refers to the act of killing the animal. You may call it animal dispatch, but think of humane as an umbrella term for the treatment of animals, both before and after it's in your possession. And then euthanasia is that process by which you're using to actually put the animal down. All right, so that's certainly important. Now, when you have an animal in your possession, what are your options? Okay, so we're going to talk about, the animal can live and on-site release. You have relocation, which is the movement of an animal within its home range. Translocation is the movement of an animal outside of its home range. I know there are people within the industry who disagree with those definitions. They think, oh, I'm being too picky. I think those definitions are important, and because they clarify things in a way that makes sure we're talking the same language. If we want to be professionals, we need to have technical terms. This is what differentiates science from someone who just has some wisdom. If in the section of what the animal dies, you have euthanasia, and then you have humane dispatch. And we'll talk about what those things mean when we talk about when the animal is getting killed. So let's refer to the AVMA definition of euthanasia. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I've had other podcasts on it, but just to refresh your memory, when you say you kill an animal according to AVMA guidelines, I'm telling you right now, you're lying to your clients. Now, you may not be wanting to deliberately lie to them, but you are lying to your clients. The reason is you are not killing that animal for its interest. Now, there may be an isolated instance. Let's say an animal got hit by a car and you know its injuries are really severe and it's not going to recover. Now you're putting it down in its interest. That would be an example of euthanasia. But when we're capturing a raccoon just because the raccoon's knocking over someone's trash can and you're killing that raccoon, you are not killing the raccoon for its benefit. You're killing it for the benefit of your clients. We just need to be honest about that, all right? I think it's important as an industry that we need to tell the truth, and even when the truth is not comfortable and difficult. So the AVMA definition of euthanasia is you must kill the animal in accordance with its interests, and you must do so in a manner that's rapid, painless, and distress-free. Then you have euthanasia according to the American Veterinary Medical Association. Okay, that's their 2020 guidelines, which are their most recent ones. Now, what do? Well, we don't really care about the animal's interest, right? To be fair, we care about the customer's interests, and we, of course, want it to be rapid, painless, and distress-free, but it also needs to be convenient and cost-effective, right? If it's costing a ton of money, we don't want to do it. If it's costing us a ton of time, we don't want to do it, right? We need to be honest about that. And I'm not saying that's bad, okay? I don't necessarily agree with the AVMA definition, right? But a lot of people in our industry are out there prancing around and telling us about how wonderful the AVMA is. I'm thinking that's a fool's errand, all right? That's a dangerous place to be. Maybe fool's errand is a bit strong. You're basically adopting a definition that's going to undermine your own ability to perform euthanasia, because the AVMA continues to restrict options so that you ultimately, you're going to have to go to a veterinarian. And I don't know too many wildlife control operators who want to have to keep bringing all the animals to a veterinarian. All right, so I'm just throwing that out there. But nevertheless, this is our understanding of euthanasia. And to make it more simple, we want it to be rapid, painless, distress-free, convenient, cost-effective, and that's how we're killing the animal. So typically, when you say you're following AVMA guidelines, what you mean is I'm following the techniques that are approved by the AVMA, but not AVMA euthanasia, okay? That's a very subtle distinction that I'm sure your clients won't understand. But be careful how you're using that term, because it may come back to bite you in terms of a liability sense. So when we use the term euthanasia in this sense, we mean death of the animal without suffering. That means the animal is going to be dead or is going to be unconscious while it's dying. And non-traumatic means that it is not, shooting an animal in the head obviously is traumatic for the animal. It may be traumatic for you as well, but you are doing it in a manner where the animal's not feeling pain. Okay. Humane dispatch, however, is the animal does experience pain. It's still conscious, but it dies quickly. It's short. It's not agonizing for hours and hours and hours. Now, why do we have this? Why do I recommend this definition to the industry? Well, because we have to distinguish between euthanasia and humane dispatch, because we're dealing with animals that aren't always in our direct control. When you're shooting an animal in the field, like when you're hunting, you're capturing that animal and you may be killing it at the same time, but that it's not going to be, you're not getting very many headshots in a typical hunting situation, right? There are situations where that can occur, but those tend to be highly controlled, often shooting over bait, with very skilled shooters and with shooting lanes in the whole 9 yards. But typically when we're doing our wildlife control work, we're not doing it with, headshots all the time, right? So, but the animal's dying quickly. It's not out there for days suffering away, right? So that would be humane dispatch. So if the animal experiences pain, that's humane dispatch, as long as it's not going on for hours and hours and hours. So killing an animal sometimes with a conibear, and the conibear's underwater, the animal doesn't die instantly, but it dies quickly, right? So if the conibear hasn't put it unconscious or kill it, the water will kill it, right? Sliding drown sets for animals would be an example of humane dispatch, right? So it's important to have our terms understood, because we need to enact legislation and regulation in our various states that reflects these two definitions. Because I'll tell you, folks, if we don't, we're facing some very serious times down the road. All right, with all that being said, we're now going to address the technique or the use of chloroform as an animal dispatch product. Okay, so chloroform, there's your scientific chemical for it. It's CHCl3. It's also known as methane trichloride. It's also known as trichloromethane. It's also known as methyl trichloride. All three of those names all refer to the same chemical product, chloroform. Now, if you want to do some serious background research on this particular chemical, you want to use what's called the CAS number. That's C-A-S, the CAS number. It's sort of a universal identification number for this particular chemical that is global. And the number for chloroform is 67-66-3. So if you do a Google search or whatever search engine you're using on CAS 67-66-3, you will see a lot of important and technical information about this particular chemical. Okay, so I have drawn from some of those documents that have been online. Now, chloroform is regulated under the Toxic Substances Control Act and Workers' Health. The Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA of 1976, authorizes the EPA to regulate chemicals that present an unreasonable risk of injury to the health or the environment. The TSCA, was amended in 2016 by the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. How's that for a term? So if you're looking to learn more, you can check things out, of course, at the cdc.gov/NIOSH/chemicals//default.html. All right, so let's continue on with this. So chloroform, what are some characteristics of this particular chemical? It's colorless. It forms a colorless gas. So when you purchase it, it comes in a liquid form. However, if you want to open the cap, it volatilizes. That means it converts to a gaseous form relatively quickly because it doesn't take a lot of heat to vaporize it. But when it's vaporized, it sinks because the gas is 4 times heavier than air. Now, when we say that, understand a breeze can stir this up, okay? But if you have still air and you've opened this container up, that gas is going to, ultimately, gravity is going to take that down to the floor level. Fortunately, it does not ignite easily. That's important because, for example, if you are using ether to try to put a skunk down, for example, and let's say you're doing it in the basement because you're trying not to let it stink, and you have a gas hot water heater that with a pilot light and you're blowing ether around, that could ignite. All right, so this is one of the safety mechanisms of chloroform, that it does not burn easily. But easily doesn't mean never, okay? So we want to be sure that's understood. Now, chloroform is a side effect of chlorinated water. So when we chlorinate water to kill the bacteria, one of the ingredients that comes out of that process is chloroform. So we're exposed to it on a regular basis, but in very, very small amounts. So I don't want people to be scared of this product, but I don't want you to be cavalier with this product, right? Just because something occurs in nature doesn't mean it isn't dangerous, right? Radon occurs in nature. You may be living in a state where your home has got radon. My house had a whole bunch of radon. I'm here in Montana. I was up in the 13 level. I forgot what the symbol was. Microcuries, I believe it was, which was way, way above what they recommend. I mean, they recommend 0, but they know that's not always practical. But I'm way up, three or four times the amount we should have. So I had my house mitigated, okay? So there's no amount of radon that's safe. Same way with chloroform. Can we say it's safe? I'm not going to say it's safe, but certainly, we have to live our lives, and certainly less is probably going to be better to have around. And certainly if we have a choice between drinking dirty water and having a little bit of chloroform exposure because we're chlorinating our water, it's obviously better to have a little bit of chloroform than it is to have dirty water. Okay, so it's all about balance. So when you're exposing yourself, when using this on an animal, understand there's some risks. So what are some of those uses of chloroform? Well, chloroform is used as a bactericide, an insecticide. It's used as a fumigant. It's used as a solvent. It's used in research. But there are concerns about its safety, so it's no longer allowed in terms of cosmetics and drugs and food. So all those things have been stripped away. Chloroform used to be part of all those products. And so that has certainly been probably the right thing to do, but it's something you need to be aware of. Chloroform does have some risks when it comes to hazards to the environment. That is, it doesn't bond to soil well. You say, well, why would I care about that? It means if you spill it, it could leach down into groundwater. So if you are using this a lot, or you're storing it and having large containers, like you can buy this in gallon forms or even larger volumes, and all of a sudden you have a leak, and this is leaking down into the groundwater because it doesn't bond with the soil. Some chemicals, when you spill it on soil, it doesn't go anywhere because it bonds with the soil so quickly. All you got to do is scoop up the dirty, contaminated soil and dispose of it. But with chloroform, it doesn't bond that way. It just goes right through. And that can be a problem when you're working in areas around wells. So treat this like a chemical. All right, this is dangerous, both for the environment and likely for you as well. We're going to talk about that here in a moment. Well, what are some of the health risks with chloroform? Well, we know that at exposures of 900 parts per million for a short period of time gives you fatigue. And that makes sense because chloroform used to be used as an anesthetic in the late 1800s for people undergoing surgery. They would treat them with chloroform, put them put them to sleep so they could perform serious surgery. Previous to that, it'd be like maybe getting them a little drunk and then taking the knife to them. So it was a horrific thing. So chloroform was definitely a major advance forward for medicine, but there are problems with it. And that is, if you're being exposed to this on a regular basis over the long period of time, they do find that there's issues with central nervous system damage, kidney damage, and liver damage, right? So how much is long term? Well, those are the types of questions that become difficult. What's the volume? Everyone can be different, but certainly when you think of, medical people in the late 1800s who would be exposed to this because they're treating various patients with it to put them under, obviously their risk would be much higher than what we're talking about. I'm suggesting that if we're going to be using chloroform, that we're using it in a limited capacity, probably for skunks, in situations where you're trying to put the animal down in a odorless manner. I'm not recommending it for anything with just regular everyday use to put down animals. Now, if it's legal in your state, we'll talk about some of the questions about laws. I mean, it's your choice. I'm telling you what my suggestion is. I think if you're going to be putting animals down on a regular basis, carbon dioxide treatment is definitely safer for you. It definitely meets one of the guidelines of the AVMA for the time being, although that may change in the future. It's certainly going to be significantly safer for you than using chloroform, and probably run less risk of if you're in that gray area for legality in your state, and we'll talk about that in a short minute, then you might want to kind of use carbon dioxide if you're for most cases. Does it cause cancer? Excuse me. We're not sure, but the researchers believe that they think it does cause cancer. Unfortunately, the research is not conclusive. Why? Because we can't test this on people, right? That would just be totally unethical. However, when they try to do these population type surveys, these longitudinal studies to see people exposed to this over long periods of time, they do find some issues, particularly with those in bladder cancer. Unfortunately, there's so many variables, they can't be conclusive with it, right? So this is the problem. Just be careful with this. It is listed under the U.S. Toxic Substance Control Act. Again, this is a chemical that has some serious dangers to it. It is listed as a hazardous material under the U.S. Department of Transportation. Those of you in other countries have to consult your regulatory bodies concerning this product. And I'll be frank with you, this hasn't been easy for me to research some of this even here in the United States. It's complicated. So I am not the final authority on this thing. So I'm trying to, give you what I know to the extent that I know it. But there are definitely, this has kind of been a little bit of a rabbit hole in terms of the research, because there's a lot of I can't say conflicting, but it's a highly technical, detailed issues in some of the terms I'm not familiar with. So it's something that you want to definitely research for yourself and for your particular area. It does have a reportable spill quantity, and this is important. So if you are looking at holding this product in, let's say you had a 10-pound bottle, maybe you were carrying over a gallon, for instance, well, then all of a sudden, you break that and you spill 10 pounds worth, you have a reportable spill quantity. Again, because why? Because this has environmental impacts to the ground and to potential groundwater. Okay, so this is important. You may want to be careful about how much you possess, because you don't want to go over that spill quantity for reporting purposes, to be sure. Your state may have lower requirements, okay, but for the EPA, it's 10 pounds. Now, here's some acronyms and terms that we need to become familiar with. And again, I apologize for this. These aren't my terms. These are terms to help us understand the regulatory limits of exposure based on OSHA. I mean, I know OSHA is the organization people love to hate, but it does have an important role as this administration to protect worker health, and they've been a force for good. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm just saying they have been a force for good, because you should have the privilege and the right to go home safe and in one piece and not have your job kill you. Okay, and I think that's a valuable goal. Your life is valuable. Work is important, but we want to work safely to the extent that is reasonable. Right? And I think that's kind of where people disagree, and those are good conversations to have. So I'm not throwing OSHA under the bus here, but nevertheless, there are some terms that we need to understand. And so when we use the phrase legal limits, that has the force of law by OSHA. There's also the second category would be recommended limits. And that is what it means, recommended. And so typically the recommended limits are lower levels of exposure than the legal limits. And sometimes the researchers really suggest the recommended limits, because sometimes the legal limits, we have to be honest about this, and OSHA is a political organization. It's influenced by politicians. And so sometimes industry will push back on certain regulations, and so they may not be the best recommendations. They're good recommendations, but that's different from being the best recommendations. So the legal limits you must follow, but the recommended are certainly strongly suggested to follow. Okay, and so I'm just putting that out there. So under legal limits, you have what's called the PEL. That's P-E-L. That's the acronym P-E-L. That stands for Permissible Exposure Limit. The STEL is the short-term exposure limit. Those of you who listen to my podcast on Aluminum phosphide and phosphine gas exposure, should know about STEL. The TWA is the time weighted average limit. That's usually weighted over 8 hours. And then you have the SEAL, that's CEIL, and that's the sealing limit. And you should never exceed that limit at any given time. So all those three, the PEL, the STEL, the TWA, the SEAL, those are under legal limits that has the force of law based on OSHA. So if you violate that, you can be prosecuted by OSHA as a violation of OSHA worker regulations. So this is going to be particular. You should be following this for yourself, but it's particularly important when you have employees, and you need to be sure you're careful with this. The recommended limits, the REL is recommended exposure limits. That's often given by NIOSH. And then you have the TLV, which is the threshold limit value, and this is the highest level of continuous exposure. Some of these recommendations come from the American Conference of Government Industrial Hygienists. That's a trade association. The acronym there is ACGIH. All right, enough of that. Let's get on a little bit more here. And so this particular frame here, notice we have the permissible exposure limit column. Notice the parts per million or the milligrams per cubic meter. Regulatory limits under OSHA are 50 parts per million or 240 milligrams per cubic meter. That's important. Now notice how California has its own OSHA regulations, and they have a time weighted average limit of 2 parts per million over an 8-hour period. So that is a very low exposure level, right? So this is something that you need to be definitely considering for those of you in California. Now, why is this important? How do you apply this when you're using chloroform? Well, here's the challenge. The research shows that if you are smelling chloroform, chloroform has a very sweet type odor. If you smell it, that's typically, if you have sort of typical nasal awareness, that's 85 parts per million. But notice the OSHA regulatory limit is 50 parts per million. So as soon as you smell chloroform, you've already exceeded the regulatory limit. Do with that as you will, but that is a very tough thing. So does that mean you wear a respirator when you're using this? Are you using a chemical capture respirator, chemical filter? I don't know the answer to that, but that's certainly something to think about, okay? But this means that if you smell it, you're already in violation of OSHA. So watch which way the wind's blowing, watch how you're opening it up. Maybe wear a respirator, I don't know. The colleague that I worked with didn't do any of that, okay? So that's just something to think about. Department of Transportation use of chloroform, they have this particular column on one of their documents that talks about hazardous materials transport. The classification of chloroform is 6.1, which just means that it's an inhalation hazard, which completely makes sense because this is one of the threats that if you carry some chloroform, often chloroform is stored in glass. What happens if you're in an accident and the glass breaks? Now you have chloroform acting as another variable in the various threats. You have gasoline, perhaps, you have motor oil around, there could be fire, and all of a sudden you're adding chloroform to this particular mix. That could be a danger not only for you and your passengers, it also can be a danger for those people who are first responders. A lot of stuff, so you need to be thinking about how am I going to transport this? How much am I going to transport this? Because it's not something you're necessarily going to have back at the office, although you could, because the value of chloroform is it's very portable, something you can use in the field if you need to put down a skunk in a very difficult area. Something definitely to think about, okay? There is avoid carrying over 1.3 gallons of the material. Again, that's because of the spill hazard, of course. And it is packing group column number 3. Some of the other terms here I'm not as familiar with. It's not something that you can transport on airplanes. So it has to be ground shipped to you. So when you purchase this particular product, you will be paying a hazardous materials fee when UPS or FedEx is traveling or bringing it by road to your particular location. Where is chloroform allowed in the U.S.? Well, that's a difficult question. And so some of the research I did shows that it is prohibited in a number of states. I obviously didn't find all of the states. That would take a lot of work. And here's the challenge. A lot of these states, chloroform is illegal for use on domestic animals. But does that mean you're not allowed to use it on wildlife? That's the question. Because wildlife are often under a different set of codes than domestic animals. But we've talked before in this podcast, a lot of people are trying to pierce the domestic wildlife barrier. That's a legal distinction. In other words, you can shoot a deer, but you can't shoot your dog. Why? Well, because deer is wildlife, your dog is a domestic animal. A lot of people are trying to make the laws that govern animal treatment for domestic animals, they're trying to make those laws apply to wildlife as well, because they're trying to ban hunting and ban trapping and all the animal rights stuff, okay? So this is where things get fuzzy in terms of the legalities of dealing with chloroform. And so are you looking for a state to give you active permission, or are you looking for the state not to prohibit? Does not prohibiting mean it's legal? Okay, these are questions you should probably talk with an attorney or do some of your own research and come to a conclusion on your own. Why does the AVMA reject the use of chloroform? In my opinion, it is likely being rejected because the AVMA requires a euthanasia technique to be safe for the applicator. And they also believe it should be aesthetically appropriate to the applicator. Well, chloroform is clearly appropriate for the aesthetics of the applicator. The animal goes down pretty easily. However, there is a threat, as I said before. If you smell it, you're being exposed, and obviously you are going to be over the OSHA limit. And we don't know what the long-term health effects of some of these microdoses are. We just don't know, but we suspect it's bad. And so the AVMA has rejected the use of chloroform for animal use. Okay, be that as it may, that's just one organization. However, the American Society of Mammalogists, they think chloroform has a place within wildlife work. And so they've actually believed it has value. One of the advantages of chloroform is it kills not only the animal, it also kills the ectoparasites on the animal. And we know that ticks and fleas and mites and things, these can pose hazards to the biologists that are looking to handle wildlife and, get samples, or perhaps are doing a study, whatever the case may be. So that's an advantage of using chloroform, is it also kills the ectoparasites that can harm the biologist that's in the field. So who do you listen to? Well, I'm leaving this up to you. You're not going to be happy with me. Ultimately, I'm telling you, this is probably a state-by-state issue. This is also a company policy issue. You need to make those decisions. So I'm going to ask you, what's legal? Does the state have to explicitly allow it, or is it the state, it's legal as long as the state doesn't explicitly prohibit it? Are you dealing with domestic animals, or are you dealing with wildlife? Because that obviously would make a little bit of a difference as well. So it's kind of a mess, and it's sad. Hopefully, we'll have an association or something do some work and some lobbying in this area, but I'm not holding my breath. And so ultimately, things are not settled. And I want to simply point out, whatever animal handling protocols that your company is adopting, understand that different people will have different definitions. And that doesn't mean I'm not a relativist. I'm not talking about all ideas are the same and your opinion, my opinion. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm just saying that there is some gray areas in this particular area of dealing with animal dispatch and animal euthanasia. be respectful of other people in the industry. We have enough problems in our industry without hating each other, right? So we need to have a respectful conversation. If you don't believe your company should be using chloroform, then say so. It's your company, then don't use it. However, you don't necessarily have to bash companies that do use it, okay? Provided it's legal or appropriate in their particular state and locale. All techniques are not equally humane. However, there's nothing that I've seen that suggests that chloroform is inhumane to the animals it's being used for. Now, I say that with one caveat, namely that chloroform can be very irritating and burn an animal's eyes. So how would you use the product? You would have the animal, let's say, in one of those plastic catch containers, and you would dribble probably a capful down the side of the trap. That way it's not don't pour it onto the skunk, because if it gets into the skunk's eyes, it can be very irritating, and that is cruel to the skunk. You just want it to go down to the side of the trap and volatilize. It's heavier than air. It'll sink to the bottom. The skunk will go to sleep and ultimately perish. If you don't have a plastic catch, then I would try to get that inside of I believe a plastic bag was being used, but I would be careful of that. I think the plastic bag can be eaten through by chloroform. I would test it a little bit first before doing that. I think we were putting the plastic catch trap inside of a plastic bag and then putting it down inside of the plastic catch trap. The plastic in the plastic catch trap is thick enough and of a different chemical where the chloroform doesn't go through. I think it will eat through a regular plastic bag, but I'm not sure about that. Would love to get your comments on it for those of you who happen to use it. So again, I've had very limited experience with chloroform, but I'm kind of impressed with it, with what I've seen. Be discreet, whatever method you're using for euthanasia and animal dispatch. Don't make a snuff film out there. If you do make a euthanasia dispatch film, make sure you guard that carefully so that you're not YouTubing it, putting it out there, because there is a need, I think, for good quality euthanasia videos and humane dispatch videos to use them as educational devices. But be careful who gets them, because if that goes, a lot of people can't handle death. And when they will go, it's an emotional reaction. As a theologian, that is truly amazing. I think it's just sort of the denial of death that people have, but that's a subject for another presentation. Change is coming, so don't be surprised if chloroform becomes banned in your particular state. If you start broadcasting this, there is always the risk whenever you're trying to lobby for something that you get a reaction from people, and all of a sudden what was gray before now becomes banned. And that is certainly an issue that we need to handle. This is why we really need strong state associations to really work with legislators and build up a war chest and try to convince people the importance of these tools. And that takes money and power, and unfortunately our industry is very disorganized. But we do need somewhere, somehow, political, somewhere an association for our industry that will wield some political might. And unfortunately, that's been very spotty historically. I'm Stephen Vantassel. I'm your host for Living the Wildlife podcast, and I do hope that you've enjoyed this particular presentation. I do have one more thing that I want to point out to you. When you're looking to purchase chloroform, understand that not all companies are the same. Now, I'm just pulled up here Lab Alley. I don't have any financial relationship with any of these companies. But I just wanted to point out that if you try to order it, notice what happens here. It says this product will only be shipped to schools, universities, laboratories, or companies. So be careful how you're ordering. But yet if you go to another company, let's say the science company here, they don't seem to have that requirement to the best that I could see here. So perhaps maybe if I go farther into the cart, there might be an issue there. So, but understand they do not take returns on chemicals. So once they ship the chemical to you, it ain't coming back. You're stuck with it. So you need to be thinking about how you're going to store this particular product, how you're going to dispose of the product if you end up getting out of the business, because you don't want chloroform just hanging around. Again, it is a hazardous material, so be thinking about that. You don't want to just be storing all kinds of it. I would be careful on how much you're purchasing. If you're new to it, my recommendation is buy a very small quantity of it, maybe a few ounces, and then try it out on a few skunks, for example, to see how you like it, provided it's legal in your particular area. If you're looking to learn more about this, one book that I would recommend is by Bob Noonan, and I think it's called Odor-Free Skunk Removal by Bob Noonan, Noonan, Bob Noonan.